Welcome, everyone. We have another episode of the Free Speech Forward podcast. As usual, I'm here with my co host and co founder of 1776 Forward, Chris. And today we're delighted we have John Suarez from Free Cuba, who's going to tell us his story and perspective all about free speech. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris so he can introduce us all to John.
Great. Thank you, Joia, and thank you, John, for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Great to have you on. So, as we always do, we like to give a little background on our guests for our listeners. And John Suarez is the executive director at the Center for a Free Cuba. Mr. Suarez was a program officer for Latin America programs at Freedom House. Prior to that, he has been interviewed by TV, radio, and print media on Cuba. And he's a human rights activist holding degrees from Florida International University and Spain's Universidad Francisco de Vitoria. He has testified before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in Washington, D.C., the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, and served as an interpreter for Cuban dissidents in congressional hearings. Since 2009, he has maintained the blog Notes from the Cuban Exile Quarter. So I love that, John, and I can't wait to hear maybe some of your stories, particularly fighting for dissidents. But we always like to start off the discussion with hearing your story of how you came to being a leader and advocate for the value of free speech.
Well, in terms of defending free speech, it was something that is sort of inherent for most Cubans. One of the big thinkers is a poet, author, freedom leader by the name of Jose Marti, who observed liberty is the right of every man to be honest, to think, and to speak without hypocrisy. A man who obeys a bad government is not an honest man. And that principle, the ability to speak freely, honestly, without fear, is something dear to me and dear to many of my friends. And it's something that has guided me over the years. And starting in high school and then in college, I was very outspoken in the classroom. I challenged assumptions by professors. I was actually silenced in a government class, a civics class, because I found out later the professor came from the hard left, and I was challenging him, and I was winning arguments in the classroom. So he basically barred me from speaking. So then I had another friend of mine who was a civil libertarian, and he started taking, basically I would pass him notes of my arguments that I would have used on the instructor, and then he would engage the instructor with those same arguments until he figured it out what was going on, and then threatened my friend also that if he was using my arguments, he would also be failed from the course. So I felt the power of censorship, especially censoring ideas when you can't advance your own agenda against them early on. And this was in high school. And when I got to university in the 1990s, I came across the speech codes. I took part in debates around that, arguing in favor of free speech. The idea being that it's only through the exchange of ideas openly and transparently, without fear, that you can actually transmit ideas, test them, see what's worthwhile and what needs to be discarded. When the state or another power center is placing a hand on the scale and advancing certain things without having them be tested through fair and free debate, bad things happen.
Thank you, John. I have to say, we've done several of these episodes already. You're the first person who's explicitly made this connection between free speech and honesty, the virtue of honesty, the importance of honesty. So I would love to hear you say more. So everybody knows Cuba has been a place that, unfortunately, in recent history has historically not been so favorable to free speech. But I would imagine there's lots of stories from people who've lived there, who've experienced why that kind of government, a government without free speech, doesn't lead to a flourishing society or a flourishing life. So maybe you can say some more about why free speech is so important for flourishing, and maybe share some of these stories of Cubanos who've learned things about that.
And also the importance of honesty. The issue is that in the case of Cuba, we had a dictatorship, authoritarian, but you still had a relatively free press. You had the exchange of ideas still taking place. There was some censorship, but it wasn't total.
Mm-hmm.
Fidel Castro was able to come to power by promising to restore the old democratic order, claiming
Mm-hmm.
that he respected free speech, the free exchange
Mm-hmm.
of ideas. Folks like a reporter out of the New York Times by the name of Mr. Matthews did exposés raising his profile, portraying him as some type of Robin Hood. And we now know that as early as the beginning of the 1950s, he was already having meetings with the KGB and planning a communist takeover of Cuba, while
Wow.
proclaiming himself publicly to be a Jeffersonian and denouncing communism. In fact, he accused his predecessor, Fulgencio Batista, of having, well, it is true. Fulgencio Batista had legalized the Communist Party and had a communist in his cabinet in his first period of power. It's sort of complicated because this last dictator before the Castros had actually been democratically elected in 1940, left office in 1944, but then came back in a coup in 1952.
Mm.
And then in his second turn, he wasn't allied with the communists as he had been in the first. But Fidel Castro was able to bring that out and attack him from that angle when
Hmm.
they were accusing Fidel Castro of his communist links. And what happens is Fidel Castro gets in, openly proclaiming one thing, while in the first months of his revolution, cracking down on the press, threatening them, eventually taking over the press, and ending all independent press on the island, which is the
Wow.
situation today. There are independent journalists today, but they are literally outlaws and risk 5, 10 years in prison for what they're doing.
Wow. Still, after all this time, it's that is still the prevailing situation.
Well, once a communist regime gets into power, it's very difficult to dislodge. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party took power in 1949. They're still there entrenched.
Yep.
Um, the Soviet Union
North
lasted
Korea.
over 70
Hmm.
years. North Korea is
Hmm.
still there. So it's yes, they're
Well,
very difficult. It's very easy to slip into this very bad idea, but very difficult to get out of.
yeah. Well, and I guess the reason I ask and seem somewhat surprised is because it definitely feels like even here, look, domestically, uh, with perhaps sympathizers or even whitewashers, there has been kind of a narrative that modern Cuba isn't as oppressive as it was under Fidel. So that's kind of where my question was rooted in.
Frankly, Fidel was more of a Machiavellian. He was also very astute at knowing who to kill. His brother, who took over, Raul, who still is running things behind the scenes, is just a straight out orthodox Marxist Leninist,
Mm.
not as smart about seeing where the future dangers are. So he just kills a lot more people. And we've seen
Wow.
with the arrival of Raul Castro to power, formally taking over from Fidel. Fidel became sick in 2006, and de facto in 2006, Raul took over. You could see an uptick in violence against dissidents, the murder of dissidents. Two of the one of the more recent outrageous acts was a gentleman by the name of Osvaldo Payá Sardinhas. He had been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, a winner of the European Union Sakharov Prize, had met with Colin Powell and other world leaders. He was murdered in
Mm.
2012, along with the youth leader of his movement, Harold Cepero. We just found out a couple years ago, after a lengthy investigation by the Inter American Commission of Human Rights, that indeed he had been murdered by agents of the Cuban government. And we
Mm.
know of many other cases like that, but this was a very high profile figure. A year prior to that, there was in 2011, Lara Poyanch, who's a leader of a Ladies in White movement, who was held in a hospital under armed guard with a lot of secret police and died under suspicious circumstances. So, what 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 makes the Payá case unique is that there was enough evidence available to demonstrate that it was an extrajudicial killing and a murder. They're very good at covering it up. In July of 2021, there were mass protests across the island. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets. There were images that came out showing people being gunned down, shot in the back for non-violently demonstrating, for screaming for freedom.
Wow.
Later on, they also have cameras everywhere, so they would go to people's homes and pull them out. And there were cases where they would go into the home and they'd shoot up the house and take people out, and then political show trials. There's no independent judiciary. So, 20, 30-year prison sentences for screaming,
Wow.
down with the dictatorship. We want freedom.
Well, as you noted, I mean, those are all examples, I think, of, uh, you know, um, just, yeah, I lost my train of thought there.
Well,
The
and I
honesty
could,
point, yes, that's the point I was making. That tyranny or the absence of free speech kind of depends on a fundamental dishonesty or deception or even just suppression. So, I think those are all really vivid examples, even in more recent times, of kind of how that
yeah.
consequence manifests.
And you were talking about how you see people here sort of whitewashing the regime. What's interesting also is these regimes organize youth congresses around the world. In North Korea, back in the day in East Germany, the Soviet Union, Venezuela, Cuba. A few years back, a group of Americans had returned from Cuba and they were speaking at the University of Miami. And we went in with pictures of Amnesty International prisoners of conscience from Cuba and
Hmm.
to raise the issue. Well, what about these people? And what was interesting, these were young Americans. One gentleman was Irish American, another young lady was of Indian origin but American born. And I'll never forget him saying, "Hey, um, no free speech for ideas against the revolution. They're in
Wow.
prison, and that's where they deserve to be.
Yeah.
We're against the death penalty now because the wrong people are being executed. But when the revolution comes, the right people will be executed."
Right.
This was
Well,
a young American at an American university in the 21st
wow.
century.
Well, there again is that hypocrisy is its own form of dishonesty, right? So,
Well, in that case, he
um,
was being very honest, very transparent.
well, honest, but certainly not applying, his own principle consistently. So, um, but so those are all examples of obviously, kind of the consequences in the absence of free speech. You have been a voice clearly in your own history for the voiceless or the censored and suppressed. So, um, maybe can you give us a little bit of insight into how you prepare to find your voice to give either a speech, a talk on the importance of free speech, or advocating for a dissident's rights, or writing a piece to kind of gather your thoughts. Maybe a little bit more of the technical principles and practices that you follow to be a articulate advocate.
Well, what I try to do is first, my principle is I want to know the truth, whether it advances my position or not, and get as many facts together and be able to acknowledge what are the strengths in my argument, what are the weaknesses in my argument, and then use that to craft uh, the position I'm advocating for. And that I'll do that for a report, also for a debate. In the debate, the ideal thing in a debate or a discussion is to be able to know your argument, know what your adversary is going to be coming back at you with, and then be ready to rebut and counter.
I love that. And I think it even segues nicely into the next question that we like to ask everyone, which is, if you had all the time, money, resources that anyone could ask, what would you advocate that someone could do, even in our current environment? What would you think would be the most effective thing that someone could do to actually make real substantial change?
Well, substantial change in what respect?
Well, substantial change to actually further free speech, I guess, in Cuba and other places where, free speech is being clamped down upon.
Well, in the case of a place like Cuba or Venezuela, the advocacy has to be for regime change. You have a totalitarian communist dictatorship that by law does not permit other political parties,
Mm.
outlaws free speech. That's called uh, enemy propaganda. It can be in written form or oral form, and that's punishable by prison. You cannot say anything critical of, and this is again by law, you cannot say anything critical of the government over the internet, or that can be grounds for prosecution. So what you really need there is a change of system. It's not reformable. You have dynasty run by the Castro family. We just learned a couple of weeks ago somebody leaked information that there's a military conglomerate that runs Cuba called Gaesa, and they control most of the economy. So what they've done is they siphoned up all the hard currency. So literally, they prohibit Cubans from having their own businesses. They prohibit farmers from farming. So 90% of the food is imported, most of it from the United States, by the way. And then the communists price gouge the Cubans, who make a fraction of what the American salary is, but they're paying more for food. The chicken that is sold by Tyson Chicken to Cuba is price gouged by the Cuban government. So Cubans are paying more for chicken in Cuba substantially than Americans in the United States, who make, 50 times more a year or more than the average Cuban.
Wow.
The infrastructure has been collapsing. There are nationwide power outages, prolonged. Um, we also know that there's a lack of food, and then what they're doing is they're trying to set things up now to further squeeze the black market. So they won't even accept their own national currency in a lot of places. You have to go in with dollars, which means you have to have family abroad that can provide you with those dollars. And on the other side of it, their top trading partner is the European Union, followed about 30% of their trade is with the European Union. Russia and China each is about 8%. Nevertheless, that engagement with Europe has not altered their behavior. The Cubans have their spies torturing Venezuelan dissidents in Caracas today. They assist Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua to maintain his dictatorship through repression. And there are thousands of Cubans presently fighting in Ukraine for Putin. So this is a regime with a long and repressive history that is hostile to democracies and works in conjunction with other repressive regimes. Another example is in 2013, when the Obama administration was already beginning its thaw with Cuba. Cuba was caught smuggling tons of weapons to North Korea, including missile technology. So
Yeah.
you need regime change. On the other side, I think, for example, in the United States, I'm 55. I can perceive that there has been a loss of free speech during my lifetime. I remember being a student, even though there were speech codes and other things taking place, there was a more open atmosphere for discussion and debate than what I see today. There was also more opportunity to, I guess, what is it, the Overton window seemed to be a bit wider in terms of what you could debate in newspaper editorial pages, etc., and get published relatively easily, and debate members of Congress, members of the military, and go to fundamentals. It seems that it's not impossible now, but it's not as easy as it used to be. And I think what we need to do on that case is push back, advocate for free speech. On the left, you have the argument that they claim that free speech only helps the powerful. I think that's garbage. I think if we look throughout, especially American history, when the United States had slavery, you had people like Frederick Douglass, a former slave, who was able to challenge that institution with his writings, with his speech. If the state was given the power to silence him, what would have become of Mr. Douglass in the 19th century?
Yeah.
So this idea that free speech somehow benefits the powerful is absurd, and we've seen it time and time again. As a matter of fact, I'd say that without freedom of speech, all other rights are endangered or non-existent. Because if somebody's violating one of your other rights and you can't verbalize it, what can you do about it?
Yep. Well, that's certainly what we're about here at 1776 Forward, why we even started this podcast, was because we noted even here in the U.S. domestically that decline in the value and even more broadly the culture of free speech, because the legal regime is actually still quite strong, but it's more the cultural aspects and norms that are observed. Like you said, what's acceptable to even debate and discuss in the first place. So, we definitely see the value of that. And thank you for sharing all these stories. I have so many more questions on Cuba, but we'll have to save that for another conversation. I guess we'll just end with, you know, we always like to end asking our guests, for anyone out there listening, whether an American here dealing with just a declining culture of free speech and wanting to debate ideas that might be taboo or controversial, or just even express themselves, or someone who's maybe in a regime like Cuba, you know, what advice would you give for how people can find their voice and courage to stand up and speak out?
Well, here in the United States, it really is a question of courage. You're not going to wind up in prison. You may be canceled at the university. The university speech codes is not just a cultural thing; it's a policy thing at the university level. And
That's
it was
fair, yeah.
something, that I was there to see it when it was being implemented, and I fought against it. I debated against it. I had op-eds published attacking it, and frankly, it's one of the reasons I did my undergraduate degree was in biology, not political science, because
Mm,
I frankly feared that if I expressed myself, my political views, that I would be punished for them in the classroom. Back then, I had friends who were A students because they passed themselves off as leftists in class, and one of them was discovered because he was working on a Republican campaign, and his grades dropped from A to C in the same semester that he was outed. So um, it's a situation that does require courage, because even if there are some consequences, the alternative of being quiet and allowing this to just roll over the society has terrible results. And I think we're seeing it now when you see uh, the degradation of the university. I don't think universities have the quality that they had a generation ago in terms of the research that's being produced, in terms of the exchange of ideas, and I think it's a danger to the future of this country, because the university is a key place for the formation of elites. And if they can't debate, exchange ideas courageously and openly, and are cowed into silence, what will that mean for our next generation in government and in the private sector?
hmm Well said. Thank you for that, and thank you for sharing your story. That we are out of time, but we appreciate you coming on. As Joya said, we always get new angles and insights, and you've definitely provided some really impactful and important ones here. So, thank you. And for all of our listeners out there, as always, look out for our next episode to drop 2 weeks from now, every Tuesday. And we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.